There is a kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with chaos or noise. A quiet weight carried by people who apologize even when they are wounded, who search themselves for faults whenever something breaks, who feel guilty for emotions they were never allowed to express. This pain is not born in weakness. It is inherited. It grows inside families where responsibility is confused with worth, where harmony is preserved by one person learning to absorb blame so others never have to face themselves. Over time, that child becomes an adult who stands in the ruins of every conflict asking, "What did I do wrong?" even when the evidence points elsewhere. This is not humility, it is conditioning. And until it is named, it will keep rewriting your inner voice, convincing you that accountability means self-erasure, that love must be paid for with silence, and that peace is something you earn by doubting yourself. Today, we expose the trait behind chronic self-blame, not to attack families, not to accuse the past, but to restore clarity, dignity, and the right to stop carrying guilt that was never yours. When responsibility is weaponized early in many families, responsibility is introduced as a virtue, something noble, something that builds character. But there is a subtle distortion that happens when responsibility is handed to a child too early and too unevenly, when it is not about learning consequences but about maintaining emotional balance for everyone else. In such environments, the child is praised not for being themselves, but for being manageable, adaptable, and convenient. They are rewarded for noticing tension before it erupts, for softening their tone, for apologizing quickly, for fixing what they did not break. Over time, responsibility stops being a skill and becomes an identity. The child learns that their role is not to grow, but to stabilize, not to explore truth, but to prevent discomfort. This is where chronic self-blame quietly takes root, not through cruelty, but through expectation. The message is rarely spoken out loud, yet it is absorbed deeply. If something feels wrong, look inward first. If someone is upset, assume you caused it. If peace is broken, restore it at any cost. As this pattern repeats, the child's inner world begins to reorganize itself around anticipation rather than authenticity. They become hyper-aware of emotional shifts in the room, tracking moods, pauses, silences, and changes in tone. This awareness is often mistaken for emotional intelligence, but it is actually a survival strategy. The child is not reading emotions to connect. They are reading emotions to avoid blame. In these families, accountability is not shared equally. One person becomes the emotional container for everyone else's discomfort. When a parent is stressed, the child feels responsible. When siblings argue, the child assumes fault. When disappointment hangs in the air with no clear source, the child searches themselves for the cause. This constant inward scanning trains the nervous system to associate safety with self-accusation. Blame feels familiar. Innocence feels risky. And questioning this role feels like betrayal. What makes this trait especially damaging is that it disguises itself as maturity. The responsible child is often described as wise beyond their years, the strong one, or the one who understands. But what is praised externally is often a form of emotional labor that should never have been assigned to a developing mind. Instead of being protected, the child becomes the protector. Instead of being guided, they become the guide. And instead of being allowed to make mistakes, they become the one who must prevent them. Over time, this creates a distorted relationship with fault. Mistakes no longer feel like part of learning. They feel like proof of personal failure. Even neutral outcomes are reinterpreted as errors. If something goes wrong, the question is never what happened, but what did I do wrong? This reflex does not fade with age. It matures, hardens, and follows the person into relationships, careers, and self-talk. In adulthood, this early conditioning often shows up as excessive accountability that borders on self-erasure. The person over-apologizes, over-explains, and over-corrects. They take responsibility for other people's emotions, decisions, and reactions. If a conversation feels tense, they replay it endlessly, searching for a misstep. If a relationship ends, they assume they failed, even when the patterns were mutual or external. This is not because they lack insight, but because they were trained to equate responsibility with worth. To them, being blameless feels irresponsible. Letting go of guilt feels dangerous. They may even distrust kindness, waiting for the moment when they will be told what they owe. This is the long-term cost of responsibility that was weaponized early. It produces adults who are endlessly self-aware, but rarely self-forgiving. What is often misunderstood is that chronic self-blame is not a character flaw. It is a learned response to emotional imbalance. The family system needed someone to carry the weight, and the child adapted. But adaptation is not consent, and survival is not agreement. The problem begins when that old role is mistaken for identity. When a person believes they are the responsible one, rather than someone who learned responsibility under pressure, change feels like a loss of self. Healing, then, is not about becoming less caring or less accountable. It is about restoring proportion. It is about recognizing that responsibility has boundaries and that not every discomfort requires self-sacrifice. True accountability includes context, shared ownership, and compassion, especially toward oneself. Love that comes with conditions. In some families, love is not expressed as a steady presence but as a reward that appears and disappears depending on behavior. It is offered when the child agrees, complies, adapts, and quietly withdrawn when they question, resist, or simply have needs of their own. Nothing about this arrangement is announced openly. There are no clear rules, no contracts, no warnings. Instead, the child learns through emotional weather patterns, warmth when they perform correctly, coolness when they do not. Over time, affection becomes something to monitor and manage. The child senses that connection is fragile, that approval must be maintained, and that being fully oneself carries a hidden cost. This is where chronic self-blame deepens, because when love feels conditional, the mind assumes that any disruption in closeness must be earned through personal failure. As this pattern settles in, the child begins to internalize a dangerous belief. Love is something you qualify for, not something you deserve. They become skilled at adjusting themselves to fit the emotional needs of others, often before they even understand their own. Discomfort is interpreted as disapproval. Distance is read as punishment. Silence feels like judgment. When a parent becomes withdrawn or disappointed, the child does not ask what the adult is experiencing, they ask what they did wrong. This inward turn happens so quickly that it feels automatic. The child learns that maintaining connection requires constant self-monitoring and that the safest way to preserve love is to stay agreeable, self-critical and small. Over time, self-blame becomes a strategy to restore closeness, a way to say, "I will fix myself so you don't leave." What makes conditional love especially powerful is that it often coexists with moments of genuine care. There may be affection, support, and pride, but only under certain conditions. This inconsistency keeps the child emotionally invested, always trying to decode the pattern, always hoping to get it right next time. The nervous system becomes attuned to approval, measuring worth through reactions rather than truth. The child may grow into someone who appears confident and capable, yet internally feels unstable, because their sense of value is externally anchored. When approval fades even briefly, the internal response is not curiosity but collapse. The mind searches for errors, the body braces for rejection, and self-blame steps in as a familiar attempt to regain safety. In adulthood, this conditioning often translates into relationships where the person overfunctions emotionally. They give more than they receive, apologize for having needs, and tolerate imbalance because it feels familiar. When conflict arises, they rush to take responsibility, not because they are always at fault, but because blame feels like a bridge back to connection. They may stay in situations where affection feels unpredictable, interpreting inconsistency as something to work harder at rather than something to question. Even in healthy environments, they may feel uneasy, unsure of where they stand, waiting for the moment when love will be withdrawn. This creates a persistent background anxiety that feeds chronic self-blame, reinforcing the belief that closeness must be earned through self-correction. One of the most painful effects of conditional love is the erosion of emotional safety. When a child cannot rely on steady affection, they learn to suppress parts of themselves that might risk disapproval. Anger becomes dangerous. Sadness becomes inconvenient. Boundaries feel threatening. The child adapts by becoming emotionally efficient, offering only what is acceptable. But the cost of this efficiency is authenticity. Over time, The person may lose touch with their own feelings, confusing self-sacrifice with virtue and silence with strength. Chronic self-blame fills the space where self-trust should be, because trusting oneself once felt like the fastest way to lose love. Healing from this pattern requires a radical shift in how love is understood. It involves separating connection from compliance and worth from performance. This is not easy because the nervous system may interpret unconditional acceptance as unfamiliar, even suspicious. The person may initially feel undeserving of steady care or uncomfortable when affection is offered without conditions. But slowly, with awareness and repetition, a new understanding forms. Love does not disappear because of disagreement. Connection does not require self-erasure, and distance is not always a verdict on worth. Releasing chronic self-blame in this context is not about blaming others. It is about reclaiming the right to exist without constantly auditioning for belonging. As this realization deepens, something profound begins to change. The inner voice that once rushed to self-accusation learns to pause. The urge to fix, apologize, or explain softens. The person starts to notice that not every emotional shift requires a personal explanation, and not every withdrawal is a reflection of their value. This is where healing becomes embodied, not just understood. Love, once conditional and fragile, is slowly redefined as something stable and self-sustaining, and in that stability, chronic self-blame loses its purpose, because belonging no longer depends on being perfect, silent, or endlessly self-correcting. The family story that erases context. Every family tells a story about itself. It is the story repeated at gatherings, implied in jokes, reinforced through memory, and passed down without being questioned. In healthy systems, that story is flexible, capable of holding complexity, contradiction, and growth. But in toxic systems, the story becomes rigid, selective, and protective of power rather than truth. Certain details are emphasized while others are quietly erased. Context is stripped away, motives are simplified, and one person often becomes the explanation for everything that feels uncomfortable. This is where chronic self-blame is carefully cultivated, not through direct accusation but through narrative control. When a family decides who you are before you speak, your inner voice slowly learns to agree. In these environments, events are rarely remembered as they happened. They are edited, emotional nuance is removed, timelines are blurred, and responsibility is redistributed in a way that preserves the family's preferred image. If conflict arises, the question is not what contributed to it, but who can carry it. One member, often the most sensitive or conscientious, becomes the designated container for tension. Their reactions are isolated from the circumstances that produced them. Their emotions are treated as overreactions rather than responses. Over time, the person learns that their experience will never be told in full, and when your reality is consistently minimized or reframed, self-doubt becomes inevitable. You begin to question not just your conclusions, but your perception itself. What makes this trait especially damaging is its subtlety. No one has to say, "This is your fault." The story does the work. Repeated enough times, it teaches the person how to see themselves. If you are described as too sensitive, you start filtering your emotions. If you are labeled difficult, you begin apologizing for questions. If you are remembered as the cause of tension, you carry that identity into every room you enter. Context, which could explain behavior, is replaced by character judgments, and once behavior is framed as personality, blame becomes permanent. The person stops asking what happened and starts asking what is wrong with them. As years pass, this narrative shaping seeps into the person's inner dialogue. When something goes wrong, they instinctively recall the family version of events rather than their own memory. They discount their intentions, ignore external pressures, and focus solely on their perceived flaws. Even when evidence contradicts the story, the emotional imprint remains. This is how chronic self-blame survives logic. It is not sustained by facts, but by familiarity. The family story becomes the lens through which the person interprets life, relationships, and self-worth. And because challenging that story once led to invalidation or isolation, the safest option feels like acceptance, even when it costs them clarity. In adulthood, this pattern often manifests as excessive self-questioning. The person hesitates before asserting their perspective, anticipating disbelief. They over-explain, provide unnecessary justifications, and soften their language to avoid being misunderstood. When conflict arises, they are quick to concede, not because they are wrong, but because disagreement once threatened their belonging. They may struggle to trust their memory, replaying conversations repeatedly to make sure they did not misinterpret something. This is not indecision. It is the residue of a lifetime spent being told, subtly and repeatedly, that their version of reality is incomplete or unreliable. One of the most painful consequences of erased context is the loss of emotional legitimacy. When your feelings are consistently separated from the circumstances that caused them, they start to feel unjustified. Anger becomes guilt. Sadness becomes shame. Boundaries feel like overreactions. The person learns to invalidate themselves before anyone else has the chance to do it. Chronic self-blame thrives in this environment because it provides a sense of control. If the problem is internal, then it can be managed. But if the problem involves systemic patterns, unspoken rules, or collective avoidance, it becomes far more threatening. So the mind chooses the simpler, safer explanation. It must be me. Healing from this dynamic begins with restoring context, with learning to place emotions back into the situations that gave rise to them, with recognizing that reactions do not exist in a vacuum and that behavior is often a response to prolonged conditions rather than isolated flaws. This process can feel destabilizing at first because it challenges a narrative that once provided order, even if that order was painful. But as context returns, self-blame loosens its grip. The person begins to see patterns instead of defects, dynamics instead of personal failures. And in that clarity, a new story becomes possible, one that allows for truth without scapegoating, accountability without erasure, and identity without inherited guilt. As this new understanding settles, the inner voice shifts. It becomes less accusatory and more curious. The question changes from "what is wrong with me?" to "what was I responding to?" This shift does not absolve responsibility, it refines it. It places accountability where it belongs, shared and contextual, rather than isolated and internalized. And in doing so, it frees the person from a lifetime of carrying a story that was never fully theirs, allowing them to reclaim authorship of their own experience with dignity and precision. Emotional silence as a survival skill. Not all harmful family environments are loud. Some are defined by what is never said, by the tension that hangs in the air without explanation, by the sudden withdrawal of warmth that arrives without warning. In these families, silence becomes the primary language, and children are left to interpret meaning without guidance. There are no clear discussions, no naming of feelings, no resolution, only pauses, sighs, avoidance, and emotional distance. For a child who depends on connection for safety, this silence is not neutral, it is alarming. And because no cause is identified, the child turns inward, assuming responsibility for an atmosphere they cannot understand. This is where chronic self-blame takes on a particularly deep and enduring form, shaped not by accusation, but by absence. In such environments, the child learns that asking questions may worsen the silence. Expressing feelings may be met with withdrawal, so they adapt by becoming observers rather than participants, scanning for subtle cues and adjusting themselves accordingly. A change in tone, a delayed response, or a lack of eye contact becomes evidence of wrongdoing. The child fills the gaps left by silence with assumptions, and those assumptions almost always point inward. Without emotional clarity from caregivers, the child constructs their own explanations, often concluding that they are too much, too sensitive, or somehow responsible for disrupting the unspoken order. Silence, meant to avoid conflict, ends up teaching the child that their existence carries consequences. Over time, this pattern trains the nervous system to associate uncertainty with self-accusation. When something feels off, the body reacts before the mind can intervene. The heart races, the stomach tightens, and the search for fault begins. The child becomes skilled at preemptive self-correction, altering behavior to prevent emotional withdrawal before it occurs. This hypervigilance is often mistaken for calmness or composure, but it is actually a form of emotional labor. The child is not at peace. They are bracing. And because silence offers no feedback, there is never confirmation that their efforts are enough. Chronic self-blame thrives in this ambiguity because the absence of information leaves room for endless self-critique. As the child grows, emotional silence becomes normalized. They may struggle to identify their own feelings, having learned that emotions are something to manage quietly rather than express openly. Conflict feels dangerous, not because of confrontation, but because of the aftermath. The withdrawal, the quiet disapproval, the sense of having crossed an invisible line. In adulthood, this often translates into an aversion to difficult conversations and a tendency to internalize tension rather than address it. When relationships feel strained, the person assumes they have caused harm, even when nothing has been said. Silence triggers guilt, and guilt demands self-blame as a way to restore equilibrium. This pattern can be especially confusing because it lacks clear cause and effect. There is no explicit rule to challenge, no statement to dispute. The person may feel irrational for reacting so strongly to silence, not realizing that their nervous system was trained in an environment where silence carried emotional weight. They may minimize their own distress, telling themselves they are overthinking or being dramatic. But the body remembers. It remembers that silence once meant distance, and distance once threatened safety. Chronic self-blame becomes a way to regain control in a landscape where communication was unreliable. One of the most damaging aspects of emotional silence is that it teaches the child to disappear emotionally, to become low-maintenance, self-contained, and undemanding. Needs are suppressed. Boundaries are blurred. The child learns to tolerate discomfort quietly, believing that resilience means endurance rather than expression. Over time, this creates adults who are capable, composed, and deeply disconnected from their own inner experience. They may struggle to ask for support, fearing that their needs will burden others or disrupt harmony. And when they do feel overwhelmed, they turn the blame inward, believing that their struggle is a personal failing rather than a natural response to unspoken pressure. Healing from this dynamic involves learning to give language to what was once silent. It requires developing emotional literacy and practicing expression in environments that feel safer. This process can feel unsettling, because speaking up may initially trigger fear of withdrawal or rejection, but with time and repetition, the nervous system learns that silence is not the only option and that connection can survive honesty. Releasing chronic self-blame in this context is not about assigning fault. It is about recognizing that the absence of communication created confusion, not defect. The child did not fail to understand, they were never given the information. As this understanding takes root, the inner world begins to change. Silence no longer automatically signals danger. The urge to assume fault softens. The person learns to pause before blaming themselves, to seek clarity rather than punishment. Emotional presence replaces emotional disappearance, and in that presence, self-blame loses its function because understanding replaces assumption and communication replaces fear. What was once a survival skill becomes unnecessary, allowing the person to step out of silence and into a life where their feelings are not only tolerated but welcomed. Breaking the cycle without becoming hard. For many people who grew up carrying blame that was never theirs, the idea of breaking the cycle brings an unexpected fear. It is not the fear of change, but the fear of losing their softness. When self-blame has been a survival skill, it often feels intertwined with empathy, kindness, and moral depth. Letting it go can feel like becoming indifferent, cold, or uncaring. This fear keeps many people trapped in old patterns, believing that strength requires self-sacrifice and that compassion must be paid for with personal cost. But this belief is itself a residue of the system that taught them to confuse endurance with virtue and guilt with goodness. Breaking the cycle does not mean rejecting responsibility, it means redefining it. Healthy responsibility is grounded in choice, proportion, and truth. It allows room for mistakes without turning them into identity. In contrast, inherited self-blame is rigid and absolute. It does not ask whether responsibility is shared or contextual. It assumes it is personal and total. This is why people who carry chronic self-blame often feel exhausted by life, even when they are doing everything right. They are carrying emotional weight that belongs to the past, replaying roles that once ensured safety but now only limit growth. Ending this pattern requires courage, not confrontation, the courage to disappoint expectations that were never fair. As this shift begins, discomfort is inevitable. The nervous system accustomed to self-criticism may react with anxiety when blame is not immediately assumed. Silence may feel irresponsible. Boundaries may feel selfish. Saying, "This is not mine to carry," may trigger guilt, even when it is true. This is not regression, it is recalibration. The body is learning a new definition of safety. Instead of equating harmony with self-erasure, it is slowly discovering that clarity can coexist with compassion. The person begins to tolerate the discomfort of not fixing everything, trusting that connection does not require constant self-sacrifice. One of the most important distinctions in this process is between hardness and firmness. Hardness closes the heart, firmness protects it. People who have carried too much blame often fear firmness because it was never modeled for them. They learned either submission or withdrawal, but not grounded presence. Breaking the cycle involves developing an internal boundary that allows empathy without absorption. It means being able to care deeply without taking ownership of emotions that are not yours. This is not a loss of sensitivity, it is the maturation of it. Sensitivity, when supported by boundaries, becomes discernment rather than self-punishment. As the old pattern loosens, the inner dialogue begins to change. A voice that once rushed to self-accusation becomes slower, more reflective. Questions replace judgments. Instead of asking, "How did I fail?" the person asks, "What is actually happening here?" This shift restores agency. It allows responsibility to be chosen rather than imposed. Over time, the person notices that relationships feel different. They are less driven by fear and more by alignment. Conflict, when it arises, is approached with curiosity rather than collapse. And when things go wrong, the response is proportionate, grounded, and humane. Breaking the cycle also involves grieving what was never received. The consistent reassurance, the shared responsibility, the emotional clarity, these absences leave marks. Allowing oneself to feel that loss is not bitterness, it is honesty. And honesty is a prerequisite for healing. Chronic self-blame often acts as a barrier to grief, keeping the focus on personal failure rather than systemic absence. When blame is released, grief can surface, and in that grief, something unexpected happens. Self-compassion emerges, not as an idea, but as an embodied response. As self-compassion grows, the person realizes that softness was never the problem. The problem was carrying it alone. Breaking the cycle does not strip away empathy, it anchors it. It allows kindness to flow outward without draining the self. It permits care without collapse, responsibility without self-erasure, and connection without fear. This is the quiet power of healing, not dramatic, not loud, but steady and enduring. A power that does not need to blame itself to belong and does not need to harden to survive.